Hey, today I'm going to be talking about destroyers in Space Engineers, and how, in a lot of circumstances, a destroyer is actually a superior ship to the cruiser. So that might be a little confusing because, fundamentally, on paper, yeah, it's really not nearly as clear cut as that, especially since the cruiser in a lot of ways is just a better destroyer. But perhaps today I'll show you the power of the destroyer and why bigger more better doesn't always play out. Let's define some terms here. I'm going to be mostly using World War II paradigms, terms, and so on and so forth, because both pre and post World War II, modern destroyer designations, cruiser designations, etc., kind of depart from a logical system. And that's a whole nother can of worms I don't really want to get into. So for me, a both combination of real life and space engineers, a destroyer, roughly speaking, is a vessel. It is typically small, one of the smallest, if not the smallest, fleet combat capable ship. It is armed with destroyer grade weapons, so typically small weapons with some mediums. Sometimes it will have a specialized weapon like a torpedo launcher. And finally, and most importantly, they are fast, cheap, and plentiful. These are critical to what defines a destroyer. In Space Engineers, some of that can be translated with destroyers, typically lacking the heavier weapon set and not using heavy armor. So in vanilla, which is quite sparse, it typically means destroyers don't get access to the railgun and the artillery turret. In our server, which has a more advanced weapon set, for the lack of a better term, it means it has access to the medium weapons, so the 220mm rapid-fire missile launcher and the 150mm turret. The heavier weapons, like the capital-grade weapons, are verboten. They don't get to have them. Thus, you end up with a ship that is cheap to produce, small in block count. We limit our block counts, or rather, the block count defines the ship class, and the ship class defines what you get to put on it. And that defines our destroyers. The cruiser, historically speaking, was built to be a non-fleet ship, specializing in hunting down and dominating smaller ships. Going into the World Wars, cruisers were typically the backbone of imperial navies, as it was the de facto method for dominating far from home, where the logistical base did not really exist to support a large fleet and or battleships. As the war kicked off and every side needed all the ships it could get, the cruiser would continue its role as the kind of main skirmisher away from home, and it would be the lead vessel in small formations. In fleet action, so decisive fleet battles, they were pressed into battle, which was typically not really desired or the design of the cruiser, but it turns out a big fast ship with big guns actually works okay, or well even. And in a reality where we really only saw 1 to 2 major fleet actions that mattered, turns out going all in with all of your ships matters when your entire nation hinges off of this single battle. So think Jutland. So, while cruisers are big, they are still fast and can often keep up with the destroyers while still offering a lot of firepower, armor, and other aspects. In a lot of ways, they're an excellent quick reaction force, and we saw cruisers used in this manner regularly in quote-unquote the real world. In Space Engineers, a lot of these trends are maintained, though typically speed is a meaningless term in Space Engineers because you are speed capped, and agility is the other term. So cruisers are still quite agile, but they can't keep up with destroyers, but they're still significantly more agile than most battleship designs. So, in practice, how does this play in Space Engineers? Well, it's defined by being larger in displacement, right? You have a set block count. It has access to those capital grade weapons I mentioned earlier. And, well, some of its maneuverability gets sacrificed for the ability to use heavy armor, both as a whole or in select key areas if you want to keep your ship mobile, right? All or nothing kind of thing. In our server specifically, this means unlocking that previously mentioned heavy armor, advanced CICs, and of course those weapons. Having bigger weapons isn't necessarily just a linear thing. When you get to a certain point, your weapons go from being a nuisance to these real battle-defining weapons. And while most ships, destroyers included, can survive multiple hits from medium weapons, a single big gun hit from a large cruiser is generally lights out for a lot of different types of ships, and that is illustrated in our server. The range and damage profile allows the cruiser to not only fight maybe one, but two, three, and maybe even more depending on how badly and the circumstance of the battle is going with the weapons it has. So, real numbers, our capital grade weapons have a effective range, right? They can range out to well beyond this, but an effective range about 1,500 meters. That is where the hit rate really becomes meaningful. And if you hang out at 1,500 meters, even if you're dodging and all that, you're probably going to get hit at some point. While the destroyer typically needs 1,000 or typically even closer than that to achieve meaningful hit probability. This means the cruiser can very much control a lot of these engagements against smaller ships while putting down effective fire. And that fire is very effective compared to the medium weapons. So much so that if you're lucky, you could probably one-shot a destroyer with these weapons, though typically it takes 5 to 10 hits to really put it out of the fight. Well, I'm hearing you say, you've done quite the terrible job of convincing me that destroyers are better than cruisers. And yeah, you're right. So far I have, because what I've described is what occurs on paper. And reality often doesn't line up with that. Because not only are battles, battles and they're dynamic because there's humans there, but also there is more to the battle. What led up to the battle? What is the circumstance? So there are two factors that you probably might imagine. The logistical reality of cruisers and, well, the chaos of battle. Let's start with the logistical aspect. In Space Engineers and in the real world, it takes time to build things. And while cruisers are bigger than destroyers, but more effective, thus justifying them, they take disproportionately longer to build. Put another way, for each block count you place, the next block you will place will be more difficult to place. Building this, you fundamentally understand this, right? It's really easy to build that first 2,000, 3,000 blocks, but that last 1,000 or 500 blocks takes disproportionately longer to do because hull is easy to build, but subsystems is hard. And a cruiser, by its very nature, due to how volume is created, has a bigger relative volume. And volume is harder to build than the hull. Put another way, a 4,000 ship block doesn't take twice as long compared to a 2,000 ship block. It typically takes even longer. No concrete number because it really depends on your build system. But even with something like a welder pit, these welder pits have to grow exponentially to accommodate a larger ship, right? Because the ship will grow in more than just one dimension, which means the pit needs to grow in more than one dimension, so you get the idea. In our universe, we use a sort of RTS-style build system. So instead of literally building the ships, we assign build times to all of the ships. Thus, once your building has built for a certain amount of time, it can produce X type of ships. So a destroyer costs 1 turn to build. A cruiser will cost 4 or 6 turns, depending on if it's a light or heavy cruiser. Now, note, a cruiser is not 6 times bigger than a destroyer, at least in our case, but it is what we use to properly indicate the jump in difficulty from building a 2,500 block ship to a, say, 5,000 block ship. Regardless what you use, the point still is the same. A cruiser costs more than a destroyer on a time basis to build. Right? The blocks on a cruiser are more expensive to build time-wise. This is both for practicality and RP aspects, right? Because let's be real, in a Space Engineers, everyone is RPing to a degree, role-playing. If your ship has a bridge, you're role-playing. If your ship has an interior, you're role-playing. If your ship is in a box with thrusters, you get the idea. So, back to whatever this video was about. Yeah, right, destroyers. So the reality is, when cash is flowing and all your commitments are met, that is, you have the ability to man your territory with sufficient number of ships and have backups for those ships should they die, well, now you can start really looking to only build cruisers. And we saw this historically, right? Once your commitments are met, everyone built cruisers, specifically in the United States, with the goal to fill in with destroyers once wartime occurred. Because the reality is, cruisers on paper are frankly just better, right? At minimum, you can view them as bigger destroyers. And in Space Engineers specifically, where crew availability is just as important as the ships, that is a very big deal, right? 3 people with a cruiser is better than 3 people with 6 destroyers, right? You see what I'm getting at? Alternatively, the cruiser also has access to just heavier weapons. This technically is a forced limitation in Space Engineers because you could strap a railgun revolver on a small grid ship if you really wanted to. But the reality is, a cruiser can just dominate. However, because war will always occur, partially because human nature and partially because this is a video game and we like blowing shit up, war will occur at some point. And by the very nature of war, casualties will always be disproportionate to your ability to build, right? Unless you're the United States, but that doesn't count. Because, well, when you're in a fight, if you can produce a lot of ships, you will bring a lot of ships to a fight, thus more ships will die in a fight, right? So if you get isolated, instead of being surrounded by 2 ships, you're surrounded by 4 ships and you're more likely to die. Thus, you could roughly say ship attrition will be percentage based, right? You'll lose 20%, 30%, 40%. So it doesn't really matter how many ships you can produce. This always sort of holds true. And we've seen this both in Space Engineers and in all of our tests and actual battles, where there seems to be a rough attrition rate of 1 to 2 ships per battle. Reality is, you can't make more ships than you're losing unless you're winning really, really hard. And when you're winning, you actually have other issues to contend with, namely rapidly increasing territory. So you need to plug the holes in your line with new ships, and you can either choose to make cruisers, battleships, destroyers, frigates, or whatever. But we're mainly focusing on cruisers and destroyers today, because that is kind of the mainstay of a military. So the answer obviously is the destroyer, because if you're struggling to fill the line, and holding the line is the most important aspect, well, you're going to build the cheaper ship, and the destroyer is considered the most cost-efficient ship just by its very nature and definition. You'll still need cruisers, because the cruisers allow you to accomplish certain missions that the destroyer cannot. But in a attritional-based war, you will typically just shuffle your cruisers around to accomplish this instead of just building a specific cruiser. At least that's what we noticed. As the war continues, you'll find the cruiser become less and less ubiquitous, even though on paper it should be significantly better, and it should destroy not only its own value in numbers, but probably more. However, due to the requirement of having to cover that territory, we just saw less and less cruisers in each battle. And we typically went from a 2 to 3 cruiser squadron with a little bit of escort as the dominant force at the start of the war. Our main faction, quote-unquote, deployed multiple stacked squadrons of basically just all capital ships and maybe 1 or 2 destroyers. However, as the war quickly wore on and these cruiser stacks kind of clashed, we ended up in a scenario where 1 cruiser and escorts became the new heavy squadron, and the standard squadron didn't even have capital ships anymore. And the reality, the meta quickly became, all those sexy cruisers were absolutely amazeballs, and all that time developing them was amazing, right? You still had this excellent squad anchor. The reality was, kill count-wise, battlefield presence-wise, and just the preponderance of them, that the destroyer did the majority of the heavy lifting. So while these factions that were established and really had these squared-away cruisers designs, the faction with the really solid destroyer design, strategy, and concepts ended up actually winning a lot of battles, because while the cruiser dominated, the destroyer was what actually won the strategic side of things. The attrition rate became so pronounced at some points that we actually even saw a move away from destroyers to even lighter ships to try to fill the gaps even more. That is a different video that I've actually already done. You can see it up here, but the point was, you can see logistically, cruisers are a bitch. They require a lot to keep in a fight, on a pound-for-pound basis. While they can do a lot of damage, right now, getting stuff into the fight, the destroyer just dominates. And we quickly found the cruiser went from the catch-all answer to a niche mission-specific thing. You had 1 cruiser typically for an anchor, and then cruisers were used elsewhere as sort of a line breaker or a siege-type vessel. Now here's the second aspect. The battlefield and the cruisers not being as effective as people think. Now, I don't want to convey the point that destroyers are better than cruisers in a battle. What I want to convey is that destroyers bring more pound for pound than a cruiser in a battle. But the reality is, you can only bring so much to a battle, and with one of those ships is worth multiple ships, the cruiser will always be better. But however, with this logistical part I previously mentioned, and how battles play out in reality with real humans behind the helms, that gap closes rapidly. And a lot of times where people would think a cruiser makes sense, well, maybe a couple more destroyers would make more sense. Like I said, the cruiser is disproportionately powerful, but paper and reality have converged. So using random numbers, let's say a cruiser has a 3-to-1 advantage, as in one cruiser is worth 3 destroyers. Well, in practice, it looks a lot more like 2-to-1, or maybe even 1.5-to-1. Because ship battles, typically, on my server at least, and from what I observed elsewhere, generally involve ship formations kind of coming up close, kind of like a high school dance, with ships on one side, ships on the other side, engaging fire at or beyond the effective range with very low hit probabilities, and ships kind of darting forward to try to isolate one of the ships, and then one of the ships does get isolated, and everyone begins to pile in. And in these types of formations, the cruiser ends up being overkill in a lot of ways beyond a one of. Because if a ship gets isolated and jumped on by 2 ships, 3 ships, it doesn't matter if the 2 or 3 ships that are jumping on it are cruisers or destroyers. It dies regardless, or it effectively gets, mobility killed or taken out of the fight, which is all that really matters. So in this scenario, the cruiser doesn't really bring much to the table other than being a very expensive vessel. Flip side, if you are the cruiser being isolated and jumped on, which is actually going to be fairly common because the cruiser is such a valuable target, yes, it can hang on for a lot longer than the destroyer, and it also has the chance of potentially taking a ship down with it. But the reality is, in the scale of skirmish-type battles, right, not huge fleet battles, a cruiser being isolated and taking one ship down with it, and then the rest of the squadron piling on, almost never ends up being a worthwhile endeavor. And because, as I mentioned, the cruiser is so valuable that the battle shifts from being a battle over whatever the battle precipitated over, right? We're defending a forward observation base, we're attacking a supply line. As soon as the cruiser shows up, that becomes the battle, and no one cares about the forward operating base, or no one cares about that supply line. It's about killing the cruiser, and the cruiser becomes the battle, because it's so valuable in a war where value is super important, because that's kind of what Space Engineers ends up resulting in. Who can destroy more material? So you go from being able to dictate a battle based around what the battle should be dictated around, objectives, and it goes to protect the cruiser, the battle, or kill the cruiser, the battle. And that ends up being generally quite bad for the defending side and very advantageous for the offensive side, because it's much easier to attack in Space Engineers, specifically when isolating a ship, because holding formations in a 3D plane without very good metrics to actually track where stuff is, right? Space Engineers versus real life, it's really easy to isolate ships that you want to isolate. Another aspect of the battle portion that I'll touch on is the reality of Space Engineers and a speed cap. Fast ships don't matter, agile ships matter. And heavy armor makes you less agile by the very nature of heavy armor. So you end up in a situation where destroyers are almost pristine right up until they're dead, because they can dodge and they can dodge and they can dodge, and they take almost no incoming fire, and then they do something stupid like go directly towards a cruiser and they get wiped out in an instant. Now, the flip side is the cruiser is agile, but it's not as agile. So the time it takes that volley, till it takes that volley, is drastically reduced. And while the cruiser can survive that volley, the reality is the weapons on the cruiser typically don't survive back-to-back volleys. And we'll end up with situations where the cruiser hull is fine, it's ready to keep dancing, but all the weapons essentially are stripped, and you only have a couple weapons left per side, and you end up in a situation where it just makes sense to pull the cruiser back, because functionally speaking, it's just a large destroyer at this point or something. Now, let's back up for a second. The reality is the cruiser absolutely brings punches to the table. Their heavy weapons are devastating and form excellent light anchors for formations, able to repel destroyers that are trying to, creep their way in and isolate a ship. And they also are great for spearheading an assault. Their heavy weapons also are just hilarious because occasionally you just get the perfect shot. It goes right through the bridge into the core of the ship or something like that, or you hit an engine and wipe out the ship, whatever. The point is, every once in a while, cruisers just completely blow up a ship in a single shot, and no one knows how, but it occasionally occurs. Cruisers also bring the ability to siege, right? Because medium weapons don't have that range. Cruisers, they absolutely have the range to outrage defensive gun emplacements. Now, destroyers can have torpedoes, but those are typically not actually brought due to their torpedoes being kind of crappy in three-dimensional space, too slow, and you generally don't even notice they've been shot at you because they all miss. But that is also a different topic. But ultimately, beyond being an anchor for your squadron, we have yet to really see, other than one major battle, which was closer to a fleet battle versus skirmish battles, and Space Engineers almost predominantly is skirmish battles, both server performance-wise, player count-wise, and other reasons. We've almost haven't seen a dual cruiser squadron in quite some time. I think the only area we've seen cruiser heavy squadrons anymore is, like I said, that fleet engagement and our rider faction. And the reason is because our rider faction is almost completely surrounded, and they only at the time had 3 tiles to their name, and only one of them was a offensive tile, so they basically just had all of their ships in the same AO. So that is a different scenario. Regardless, hopefully this was semi-insightful. I didn't want to go too hard in the reality of our PvP scenario, because after all, it is our PvP scenario. We have our mods, we have our weapons, right? We tried to keep it in a degree of balance, but ultimately not all of what I say will apply to you and your PvP system, right? Depending on what you use. But that's why I wanted to keep it more vague, so the concept and idea could apply to you. Regardless, hopefully this was semi-insightful on how cruisers and destroyers play out on my PvP server. If you're interested in the series, perhaps go check out Outlands. This is a series I do with around 40 to 60 players. It is mostly unscripted, D&D-esque Space Engineers PvP RP server thing, where we play a lot of moves at like an RTS level, right? But then the actual battles are played out by people. And then finally, we have a full-on survival server, or scenario, more likely, where we have a group that is separate of the faction system that actually plays out and interacts in this world. So if you want to check that out, I make videos on that, and it's really cool. But regardless, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening to my talk here, and I'll see you guys around.